Hello everyone and welcome to week 8 of our class, where we're going to focus this week on procurement management, stakeholder management, and program management. Last week our focus was on project execution, actually getting project work done, monitoring and controlling what was going on, and then actually closing a phase or the project itself when the work was completed. This week we're going to focus on some other knowledge areas that are important to getting our project done. And we'll start with procurement management. Procurement management is nothing more than using a vendor to procure a product or a service. So it's nothing more than setting up contracts to get things that you need to get your project done. So the key elements here, as in most of our knowledge areas, there's the first part is to plan what we're going to do, then to do it, and then to control it. So the three parts of this are planning procurement management, actually conducting procurements, and then controlling procurements, which is where we look at what we've received, the product or the service, to make sure it meets our requirements and that we're getting what we paid for. So let's take a look at planning procurement management. So for each of the knowledge areas we looked at so far, this is the first step, to plan how we're going to do it. And the key thing here, if we look on the output, the key thing is the procurement management plan. So we're going to take all of our normal inputs, the charter, our business documents, the scope, and so on, and we're going to determine how we're going to go about procuring the things that we need for our project. How are we going to set about asking vendors to provide us with bids? How are we going to let them know exactly what we need? How are we going to decide which vendor we want to use? All of those need to be laid out in the procurement management plan. There's a lot that goes into this, and there's people who focus only on procurement. So we're just going to touch on it now so that you understand that what goes on at a high level, and that it's very important to a project because projects buy a lot of things, from materials to services, to get the actual deliverable completed. There's several types of documents that are used in procurement. I just want to touch on them so that we kind of understand what they are and where they fit. So we just talked about the procurement management plan, which is how we're going to go about doing procurement. And another one is the procurement strategy. So, how are we going to go about it? Are we going to how do we want delivery of the things that we want to purchase? What type of agreements and contracts are we going to use? How are we going to go about finding our vendors? That's our strategy. We also have to decide sometimes whether it makes sense to procure it or to build it ourselves. And that's all part of that. And then a little more detailed here on the right-hand side, you have a statement of work. This is something that we would give our vendor or possible vendor that says exactly what we want. You can consider it the scope statement, if you will, of what we're procuring for. So the scope says, here's what we want, here's the requirements, exactly what it needs to look like. That's what a statement of work is. It goes outside the project and goes to a vendor to procure that actual item or that service. And then we also have bid documents on the far right. Bid documents are requests that we put out to different vendors. We can request just general information. We can request a proposal, which is where a vendor will give us a possible solution for a business requirement that we have, or a request for a quote, which is the most specific, where we're just asking for what is the price of a particular product or a service that we want to purchase. So then we actually go about conducting procurements, which is nothing more than setting up contracts. And again, there are people within organizations that this is all they do is contracting and procurements. But the key thing here, the outcome is contracts that we send or that we sign with vendors for either a product or a service that they're going to provide for us as part of the project. So conduct procurements is nothing more than just getting the contracts signed so that whoever the vendor is can provide us with the product or service that we need. And then controlling procurements is pretty straightforward. That's where we're going to look at what the vendor is providing. Does it meet our requirements? Does it do what it's supposed to do? Was the quality correct? Was it provided on time? We can look at all of those things to make sure we understand how well the vendor is doing in meeting their contractual obligations. And of course, adjust as needed. Okay, so we just looked at procurement. Now let's take a look at another knowledge area, which is stakeholder management. A while back, we looked at communication management in a project. Stakeholder management is linked closely to communication management because that's how we're going to talk to our stakeholders. But we have to consider the stakeholders separately of communications because we need to really understand the stakeholders that are out there, what a particular type of stakeholder needs in the way of information and communications, and then we need to go about giving it to them. So again, like most knowledge areas, we're going to take a look at what we need to do, which is identify stakeholders, and then we need to plan how we're going to go about taking care of them or engaging with them. And then we're going to actually do it, which is manage stakeholder engagement, and then we're going to step back and take a look at how we're doing so that we can understand how well we are engaging with our stakeholders, because communication is a two-way street. You have a sender and a receiver. The monitoring part of stakeholder management looks at it from the receiver's point of view. Are they getting the information that they need? Are they happy with it? And so on. So that's stakeholder management. So let's take a look at each one in a little more detail. First thing we have to do is identify stakeholders. What you don't want to do is think of stakeholders only as the key people in the project, like the sponsor, executive level folks that are involved in the project, and so on. Stakeholders are everybody, from the end user that's going to get the product or service that we're going to deliver as part of the project, to the project team itself, to our vendors, and anyone else that is involved in the project is a stakeholder. You have to identify them all. Now, some you may not identify necessarily by name. If you have a vendor that is providing you a service, the vendor will be a stakeholder, and you'd have a point of contact at that vendor, and so on. But you have to identify them, and the key folks need to be identified by name, and some others kind of maybe as a group, because you might have a user group. You might have 500 users, but you're not going to actually work with all of them. You're going to have representatives that will represent that user group. So you need to go through and identify all of your stakeholders from the top to the bottom, and you need to manage how we're going to communicate with them. And then we need to plan what we're going to do. Different stakeholders have different requirements. Someone who is just an end user who's going to get the product has a certain level of communication and engagement that's required, and your sponsor, who is ultimately responsible for the project, has a different type of engagement requirement. So you need to think about each of the stakeholders and the type of engagement that they need. And I got a chart here next to help you with that. Okay, the way we look at it is we've identified all the stakeholders. So you have a big list, from 1 to however many stakeholders there are. And you can categorize your stakeholders in different ways. And if you take a look at this chart here from the left to the right, you have those people who are unaware. They may be a stakeholder, but they're unaware of the project. They really don't know much about it. They really don't care. Then you have, moving to the right, those who are resistant. They're aware of the project. They're not really a fan of it. They don't really like it. And they don't really care too much, but they're not really they're not invested in the success of the project. Then you have those who are neutral. They kind of really don't care either way. And on the right-hand side, you have those who are supportive or leading the project. And this is important because you have your stakeholder list. Some stakeholders are more important than others, and you have to assess where they fall in this continuum. You might have a key stakeholder who is supportive. That's great. You treat that person one way. You might have another key stakeholder who is resistant. Well, you have to treat that stakeholder differently. The information you might share with a supportive stakeholder, someone who is on your side, is going to be different than what you're going to share necessarily with someone who is resistant. So you got to be careful. You don't ever want to say anything that's untrue, but you can determine the way that you go about approaching and providing communications to your stakeholders depending on where they fall in this continuum of choices. And you've got to handle them accordingly. This is probably the most important thing you'll do as a project manager, is understanding your stakeholders and making sure you handle them correctly. And this is what we talk about here, is managing stakeholder engagement, actually going about and doing it. Okay, and that means meetings, emails, reports, one-on-one conversations, phone calls, whatever it is to make sure that your stakeholders receive the appropriate amount of information and the type of information that they need based on where they fell in that scale that we looked at on the last slide. Okay, the person that you directly report to or the project sponsor probably needs the most information, good, bad, and ugly. Somebody who is kind of less of a less important stakeholder who may be resistant, you might just, couch what you provide to that person. You don't want to give them ammunition that they can take forward and go, see, the project is failing. So you want to make sure you provide them truthful information, but be smart about what you're giving them. And that comes from experience. I really can't explain it any other way. And then finally, you're going to monitor stakeholder engagement. You're going to look at, step back and say, think to yourself or ask others, are they getting the information that they need? Are they constantly calling me asking questions? If they're constantly calling and asking questions, then you're not providing them enough information. If they don't know what's going on, or they're taken by surprise by things that you tell them, you're not providing them enough information. You need to step back and look at your engagement plan and adjust it. You want to give the stakeholders the appropriate amount of information for where they fall in your project, in the importance scale, and where they are in that continuum of how they feel about the project. Okay, so that is stakeholder management. Now let's take a different look here. So we've pretty much gone through the knowledge areas and the process groups. Okay, let's take a look at programs and portfolios. Up to this point, we were dealing strictly with projects. Okay, projects are focused on a single deliverable, but there's more than that. You also have programs and portfolios. So as you go from the bottom to the top of this task, you see multiple projects there, 1 to 9. Okay, multiple projects will make up a program, and then multiple programs will make up a portfolio. And the key thing here is who's in charge and how broad is their the scope that they're looking at. A project manager is in charge of one project. They're looking at that particular narrow lane. A program manager will manage several projects to provide business value to the organization and have a much broader view. And a portfolio manager will manage several programs as well as some independent projects, again, a much broader view, working towards the business benefit of the organization. So you go from a narrow focus at the project to a broader focus at the program and the broadest focus at the portfolio level. And there's a whole book in project management called The Standard for Program Management, which is found in the PMI library. And I throw this chart up here just to kind of give you an idea of the differences. We don't need to go into a lot of detail here, but going from the left to the right kind of shows you the difference, especially in the scope and the planning portfolio and the management between a project, a program, and a portfolio. Again, project is the most narrow and a portfolio is the broadest. And lastly, we'll talk about Agile. What we've spoken to pretty much up through the 7 weeks of our class has been traditional project management, which works very well if you have a clearly defined scope, you know exactly what's required to accomplish the scope and get from the beginning of the project to the end to produce your deliverable. The work is clearly defined, you can break it out, you can estimate it, you can assign it, you can monitor it, and that works great. It works great for things like building a house, clearly defined. Some things don't do well in that framework. Software and services, for example, when you're developing those, don't necessarily don't do well with that type of framework for project management. So Agile was developed to support that. And the idea here is you don't know everything up front, and you can't make a perfect plan from the beginning that you're just going to run through and execute and check things off and everything's great. It doesn't work that way because the sponsor doesn't necessarily know what they want, and the project team doesn't necessarily know how to get there from the beginning because things aren't well defined. And so the focus on Agile management is to focus on delivering small chunks of deliverables and working closely with the sponsor in a collaborative way to produce things, respond quickly to change, and give the sponsor what they want. So start with the key requirements, build a small part of it, see how that looks, take feedback, make changes, and then go to round 2 and round 3 and round 4 and work towards the end state. As you go, the sponsor has a clearer idea of what they want, and the team has a clearer idea of how to get there. So rather than knowing it all up front, Agile goes about it by saying we just need a little bit to work with, and we're going to see where we go from there. And here's the Agile Manifesto. We're not going to go through this in great detail, but you can take a look at it. It's in the PMI library as well. But the big thing here, just like I mentioned, is small chunks. Get it done. Get something done quickly into the hands of your customer. Let them provide you feedback and make changes as you go. You're not going to be able to just have it all laid out up front real pretty and then just work through and check off the tasks and be done. It's not going to work that way. All right, let's take a look at our assignment for week 8, which is our last week together. So this week we're going to look at ITP 7, which is making some changes to our project. If you look at that thing, the instructions on page 59 to 63, it tells you the changes you need to make based on some things that happen. So some tasks are going to be lengthened and some changes are going to happen, and you're going to have to modify your project schedule and then talk about what that's going to mean to your project. And then the second part of it is putting together kind of an assessment of how you did, which is TPP2, the project postmortem. So the first week of class we did TPP1, which was how we're going to plan our class. And now we're going to look at it, well, after 8 weeks, how did we do? We're going to assess our performance. And those are the two things we need to do for this week. And again, if you have questions, please email me or post on Ask Your Professor. Please don't wait to the last minute because this is our last class. Thank you, and we'll talk to you soon.